Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another episode of Anatolian Dispatch, one of several podcasts sponsored by Aval News, your best source of information on all things Turkish. Although that might be corrected by the end of today's podcast. For all things Turkish, we have a source today. Today with us is Mr. Jeremy Seal. I will read you a little bit of his background. He's a travel writer, teacher, broadcaster, and tour guide with a lifelong fascination for Turkey. His first book was A Fez of the Heart and was shortlisted for the Thomas Cook Travel Book Award and traced the astonishing history of the cone-shaped fez hat that was banned in Turkey in 1925. But in the spring of 2016, travel writer Jeremy Seal went to Turkey to investigate perhaps the most dramatic, revealing, and little-known episode of the country's history, the 1960 military coup, which deposed the traditionalist Prime Minister Adnan Menderes, who would later be executed by the ruling junta. In A Coup in Turkey, it is a thrilling account of the events that took place and the trials and executions, but more importantly, it traces what took place so long ago, which continues to resonate right down to the present day. The irony is that it was in spring of 2016 that Mr. Seal traveled to Turkey to investigate for his book on the 1960 military coup. And while he was working on the book, another coup attempt took place, which fortunately failed. So we're going to have the discussion of the book and focus also on how the events of 1960 continue to resonate in Turkey to the present day. Oh, and by the way, before I miss it, although I will mention it again at the end, if you want to read more of what Mr. Seal has written, go to somewherewonderful.com. And I will tell you how to get the book. Right now, it doesn't have an American publisher, but thanks to the internet, you can go to Amazon.com and look up Jeremy Seal, A Coup in Turkey, and they will be able to send it to you from the Book Depository, which is Amazon's book outlet in Great Britain. So either go to Book Depository US or go to simply Amazon.com and search for Jeremy Seal, A Coup in Turkey, and you too will be able to order the book online and get it delivered, although not as speedily as I would have preferred. Anyway, over to you, Jeremy.
Ed, hi. Yeah, and thank you for having me. Yeah, the book is called A Coup in Turkey, and it is my attempt to explore what I take to be the most interesting and the most little understood decade in modern Turkish politics, which is 1950 to 1960. It's the decade when Adnan Menderes comes to power in 1950. He's the first democratically elected prime minister of the country, and his arrival in 1950 on a landslide, which at least temporarily sees out the Republican People Party of Ataturk, has the effect, I think, of ushering in the beginning of what we might call a counter-revolution. This is the moment when, albeit Menderes wants to carry on in terms of the modernization of the country, he takes Turkey into NATO in 1952. He joins the anti-communist coalition in Korea in 1959 and 51. What also happens in the course of that decade is that Menderes, I think, in response to what he understands to be his democratic responsibility, he starts to roll back some of the secularist reforms which were undertaken by Ataturk and latterly by İnönü from 1922, 1923 onwards, right through into the 1930s. So you get this moment where the voice of the people that has not been heard up until that first democratic election in 1950 begins to be expressed through Adnan Menderes, who, for example, in his first action, shortly after coming to power, repeals the law whereby the azan, the call to prayer, can only be made in Turkish. And Menderes decrees that it can from then on be made in the traditional sacred Arabic. And for a lot of secularists, for a lot of followers of Ataturk, this rings a major alarm bell because it's the beginning of a process of allowing more space for Islam in the life of the nation. And I think actually from those very beginnings, Menderes's final fall in 1960 can be traced. There are other reasons why it all goes wrong. The economy, which starts so well for him, begins to falter and becomes a mess. But I think it's at the heart of why the army take against him, and they take against him increasingly overtly from the late 1950s, is because he represents a real threat to Ataturk's secular vision, to Ataturk's secular legacy. And it's the army that overthrows him in 1960, on the 27th of May 1960, as many of you will know. And it is that moment, I think, that is the very first time in the modern Turkish state that there has been a coup. And I regard that as really important, because it seems to me to be the template for all the coups that happened since. It was a real decision for them to undertake this first coup, because they all knew, the army all knew, that at the heart of Ataturk's vision was the fact that the army was to have no place at all in civilian politics. So
Right.
This intervention was not only an intervention against Menderes, in a sense, it was also an intervention against the prescriptions, the insistence of Ataturk himself. So what we get in 1960, at the end of that decade, is the fall of Menderes and the beginning of the junta's attempt to discredit him. I don't know if you want to pick up at that point, Ed, or whether you just want me to carry on.
Well, no, I think I would just take note of the point you're making about how the coup in 1960 that displaced Menderes really was contrary to the prescriptions for civilian military relations, which is my field, that Ataturk had laid down. And there's a great misapprehension, particularly in the United States, among many of our national security people who focus on Turkey, that in some way the legacy of Ataturk is military intervention in politics. And you're saying, no, that was not the case.
I think that's absolutely right. He was very, very clear. He was very clear time and again from the very beginning of time that he came into power that there was to be no place for the army in the governing of the country. That said, the junta justified its actions by saying, but hang on, when Ataturk led the independence campaign from the 19th of May 1919, what was that if not a coup against the state? So you can argue it both ways, but I think it is certainly the case that Ataturk's vision was to avoid coups as far as he could. By the same token, there is no question that he would have been very offended. He would have been outraged by some of the things that Menderes did. So not only was there the example that I've given of the change of the azan, the call to prayer, from the stipulated Turkish back into Arabic, but there were any number of other encouragements to the place of Islam in the public life of the nation.
Could you just mention maybe a couple more so our
sure,
audience has
under Ataturk, for example, the shrines of old holy men were closed. The people were not allowed to worship at the shrines of holy men. Ataturk regarding it as a disgrace to seek any kind of answers from the dead. There was Islamic readings of the Quran on the national radio. Theological schools, Islamic theological schools were opened up again, and there was a large program of supporting the rebuilding, the restoration, or the building of new mosques from the whole way through. And this led up in 1957 to the beginning of discussions about the building of the Kocatepe Mosque, the big mosque in the middle of Ankara that you will know, which although it was not eventually built until the 1980s, was first mooted and supported by Menderes in 1957. So you've got all these manifestations, if you like, of Islam finding a much more important, a respected place for itself in the life of the nation, as I say, from 1950. So
let's explore that a little bit. So what was the real motivation of,
Menderes?
of not of Menderes, but I mean, okay, yeah, let's start with that, and then let's go to the coup leaders, because that then gets us into these roots of the present day. So what was what was Menderes's real motivation for making these changes?
I think this is a really good question. And I think it's this. One has to understand that when democracy was first introduced in Turkey, quite suddenly, actually in 1946, as a consequence, not of the country necessarily being ready for it, but because the powers that be in 1945 were very aware that the Turkish war record had not been great in terms of their refusal to come in on the side of the Allies until very, very late on, and actually having supported and having sold chrome to Hitler right up until late in 1944. And the fear on the part of the Turks was that the Russians, the Soviets, might actually make Turkey their first point of invasion, because of course there is this historic interest on the part of Russia in not only the Bosphorus and their route to the warm seas of the Mediterranean. So democracy was introduced very suddenly in 1946. The first, as I say, properly democratic elections were won by the Democrats in 1950. And I think what this meant was that despite the fact that a lot of the politicians had a theoretical understanding of what democracy was all about, they had no idea if that actually worked on a day-to-day basis in terms of the parliament. And there was this sense, and it was possibly slightly naive on Menderes's part, but also very interesting too, that his role as a Democrat had to be to serve the will of the people, had to be to serve the will of the people who had put him in power in the first place. And he was very aware that his constituency, broadly speaking, was based upon the poorly educated rural masses, but also upon the small businessmen who had been somewhat sidelined through the statist years of the Republican People's Party. So, and he regarded, if he was going to make a generalization, that for those people, small town piety, the place of Islam, was absolutely essential to their understanding of what constituted the kind of society that they wanted to see Menderes bring in. And therefore, it seems to me that he understood his role to be precisely that, despite his awareness that the constitutional legacy, the constitutional basis of the country since Ataturk was essentially secular. So he was left in a situation where his responsibilities as a Democrat, as he understood them at the beginning, slightly came into conflict, increasingly so, with his responsibilities as a son of Ataturk, and as therefore a secularist. And I think that's how that process began. And I think it was that understanding that leads Menderes increasingly into trouble, because he's putting the backs of the army up with every passing day as the 50s unfurl, if you like.
So let's now turn to the army.
Yeah.
It wasn't just the perception that he was introducing Islam. There had to be more to it. So what was the more in it? Okay, so they resent, or they oppose, this diminution of the secular power.
Yeah.
But what else was there?
I'll tell you. I think the first thing was personal, that in this revolution, if we can call it that, the Menderes ushered in, there was this movement in terms of who were the favored constituencies in the country, which had formerly been the state-educated, salaried elites, the bureaucrats, and first and foremost, army officers. Under Ataturk, army officers had the greatest prestige of all in the country. Under Menderes, that all changed. He looked to the peasants and to the business people, to the commercial people. They were the people who mattered. And so the prestige of the army officers, and indeed the pay of the army officers, fell dramatically in the course of the 1950s. So you've not only got their sense that Menderes was disrespecting the ideological basis of the Turkish nation, but he was also disrespecting them very personally. and he was presiding over an economy that was falling apart, and creating increasing amounts of civil unrest. So from 1959, what you get is protests, primarily by the students, but also by the lawyers and by the teachers and any number of other people who feel that their place has been threatened by what has happened under the Menderes regime. And therefore, the army feels it is incumbent upon itself at some point to intervene, if only to stop what it sees as being the prelude to a possible civil war. So it has a series of justifications for the action that it then goes on to take in May 1960.
Could you just speak, could we now like turn to how this has
Played out
percolated through, you know, I mean, how many coups, you know, they started in 1960, we had one, what, in 1971?
Well, there were more than that, actually, Ed. Yeah, I mean, the coup order is 1960. Then there were two attempts at coups in 1962 and 1963, failed, but full attempts. 1971, 1980, and then you get various degrees of attempted coups, because of course we have this notion that a coup is the full-blown thing whereby you have tanks on the streets. But the Turkish military has also operated sometimes in a more subtle way, whereby all it's had to do is to actually nudge the powers that be and say, we no longer accept this government. You have a choice. You can either resign or you can face the consequences. And on several occasions, the prime ministers obviously made the choice to resign, not least the Welfare Party, for example, in 1997. So you've had this series of coups, each of which I think has further undermined the substance of the democratic civilian basis of the state. And one of the things that I say in the book is that, from my perspective, I was a travel writer. I continue to be a travel writer, and I've always worked to present what I see as the most wonderful view of Turkey as a land of generous people, amazing landscapes, fantastic cultures, food, and the rest. But always, when I've been presenting this, I've come up against this other image, which kind of counters it, which is the image of, it tends to be a khaki-colored image of tanks on the streets, people being picked up in the small hours, and the rest. And it seems to me that this is the problem for Turkey, that it has become as associated with coups as, for example, missile launching tests has become with North Korea, or school shootings in the United States, or farmer strikes in France. It has become the single defining feature if you're looking for the adverse side of where we are in Turkish culture. And I think that's a great, great sadness. And I suppose that's only been accentuated and exacerbated by what has happened over the last 10 years, if you like, not least 2016, which we can go on to talk about, unless you want to pick up some other aspect of this before we get there.
I think we need to get to 2016. So you were there in spring 2016.
Yeah.
You were still there when the coup attempt actually took place.
I was not.
You were not. You had moved. You'd come back.
I'd come home. Yeah, I'd come home. I mean, what effectively happened was that I'd been following this story for quite a while. I had an increasing sense that Menderes was the untold story. It seemed amazing to me that nobody in the West really knew much about him. And I think that's partly because one of the things that strikes me as interesting about Turkey is that the iconography is completely dominated, A, by Ataturk, and to a lesser degree by whoever is the man in charge at the time. So over the last 10, 15, 20 years, it's been Ataturk and Erdogan. And so when I came across Menderes, I was very surprised to get a sense of just how much support there was for him, particularly amongst elderly people, not least in the countryside. And I began to sense there was this untold story. And then the more I learned about him, the more I realized that the arc of his story actually compared interestingly with that of Erdogan himself. You know, beginnings, espousal of democracy at the beginning, and then a gradual retreat from it in the course of the years in power, attended by more and more journalists being put in prison, and an inability, it seems to me, on the part of both of these men to stomach the kind of criticism that should actually come as part and parcel of the role of any politician in a fully fledged democracy. So you get that sort of sense that the two stories are very, very similar, and in other ways too. The Erdogan's interest, for example, in building and promoting mosques, as in the case of Menderes. And if you visit, if you attend an Erdogan regime, you will see endless placards, often of the two men together in similar poses and being presented, if you like, as the two kind of great supporters of traditional, orthodox, pious Turkish society and life. So you get this extraordinary parallel, which then plays out finally in this incredible, unexpected, at least to me, event, which is the attempted coup of the summer of 2016.
You know, it's interesting you say that it was unexpected. It was unexpected by most people, most analysts. And I can tell you this from working at the American embassy and working with people. Most, if they're honest, I mean, now there, of course, are people who now say, oh, well, no, we saw this coming. Yeah. I think actually, other than Chris Kilford, I don't know anyone who really did see it coming. I mean, Chris and I had conversations about this when we were both there because we were there at the same time. And my contention was that Turkey has moved far enough along on the road of democracy and democratic processes that a coup is now not possible.
Yeah.
Chris's point was, no, there's still some underlying problems that make it possible. Although we did agree that if it occurred, it would not succeed, or certainly not in the way that previous coups had succeeded. In fact, I think both of us agreed that if a coup had taken place in 2016 and succeeded, in quotation marks, you actually would have had a civil war.
I agree.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so could you talk a little bit about, you know, that perspective, that what was the things remaining from the legacy of 1960 that were still present in the civilian military culture of Turkey that did make it possible for a bunch of officers to really think they could pull it off?
Well, I think, broadly speaking, the presumption of that bunch of officers that it was still up to the army to be the ultimate arbiter in the life of the nation, combined with that, the kind of bizarre presumption that the world of 2016 was in no way different to the world of 1960, at least in terms of what it would take to stage a coup. And it's really interesting when you look at the two coups and why one succeeded so absolutely and so quickly, and why one failed so spectacularly. And it seems to me it's down to this presumption that nothing was changed. So what you get in 1960 is that in a few hours, in the middle of the night, the country the country falls to the army, who take over the Parliament building, the one radio station, a few other strategic points of views. There are no bridges across the Bosphorus to worry about. The airport, such as there are, and the presidential palace. They pick up not only the president and the prime minister, the ministers, and everybody else. That's to say, all the deputies, all the members of parliament, and it's done. And there's nobody to argue against it, because there is no, apart from the army, there is no opposition. The people don't have anything like social media. They don't have a way to communicate. There aren't many telephones. So it's a done job. And then you scroll forward to 2016. The coup takes place on a Friday in the evening when everybody's out. And there is no attempt to pick up there is no concerted attempt to pick up the leaders, least of all Erdogan. And the whole thing is a complete shambles. It seems that the leaders of the coup have not even been in contact with the significant, important leading generals and other chiefs of staff that they need to have on side. And they just kind of assume we tell them about this at short notice and they'll buy into it. Well, of course they don't. So it's ridiculous. And this has been indicated by any number of other people, to the point that it's hard to believe this was for real. And I think that's what's so interesting about it, that the Turkish army has always been regarded as very impressive, incredibly efficient, and yet they were purportedly, at least, able to stage this thing which was so far off base and failed so thoroughly that then that ushers in all these theories about, was it really what it was supposed to look like? And I don't know. I'm aware that you're in Philadelphia, and I'm aware you're therefore not too far away from Mr. Gulen, which is also very interesting too. But I guess that's a conversation for another day.
Well, we should have that conversation. I have actually met Mr. Gulen.
Right.
Briefly, a couple of years ago, long after I had left the State Department. So there's nobody is starting to go with their conspiracy theories. And there's a history about why a friend of mine, who is a Gulenist, thought it would be useful for me to go to a very staged, orchestrated, choreographed visit. But we'll set that aside for another day.
Exactly. I mean, what I wanted to say, if I've got time to say it, is this, that ultimately what it comes down to, it seems to me, is that if Menderes is important, it's because the two sides, the two camps in Turkish society, see him in such polarizing fashion. The secularists tend to see him as the worst thing that ever happened to Turkey, the traitor of Ataturk's great ideals. The Islamists, the traditionalists, see him as the hero of traditionalist Turkey. And he's become a symbol for either side, and such an extreme symbol that's why it seems to me that the politics has become so polarized, because nobody's able to see him for what he really is, which is a human being. I've tried to therefore arbitrate and to present a much more rounded, I hope, portrait of a man who seems to me to be neither of those things. He was a complicated, nuanced, flawed, hypersensitive, difficult, also brilliant, charming, complicated kind of man. And I just wish that the two sides in the Turkish argument could begin to accept that that's how they should be seeing him, rather than these very fixed, extreme positions on either side.
Right, to actually see him as a man,
yeah,
rather than as a symbol or an icon for their particular beliefs. I want to go back to one thing you said. The book opens, from what I've been able to read, with your visit to a place where Menderes is commemorated, or there's a museum there for Menderes. Is that correct?
No. There is a museum. There is a new museum on the island of Yassıada in the middle of Istanbul, which is where the trial of the regime took place. Fascinating place. Yassıada, middle of the island. Yes.
One of the things that apparently has been going on during the time of Erdogan's leadership is really kind of a rehabilitation of Menderes.
Very interesting process. Yeah. It began actually before Erdogan, but it's gathered pace over the last 10, 15 years. And it culminated, as you say, with the restoration of this prison island, Yassıada, just off Istanbul in the Prince's Islands, which was where all the regime members were held for the best part of 15 months while they were tried for the crimes of the regime. And it's now been turned into a museum, if you like, a kind of shrine to the memory, particularly of Menderes, because he, of all the people who was persecuted, he was the one who was most particularly humiliated, brought down in spectacular fashion by the army, because they knew that he was the man who was most adored by those people who followed him, i.e. mostly the country people. He had huge amounts of affection amongst country people.
So you mentioned that, part of the resentment by the coup leaders, regardless of whether they were, followers of Gulen, or whether they were the military or wherever they were coming from, was a personal resentment of what Erdogan was doing. Was this rehabilitation, which really was gathering speed by 2016, do you think that played a good bit in?
It's an interesting question, because certainly I have a lot of friends who are, even though they were born after Menderes was hanged, still regard him with absolute antipathy, comparable in many ways to the antipathy that a lot of them feel for Erdogan too. So by logical extension, you're absolutely right to say that any attempt to rehabilitate Menderes is going to offend those who don't like him. But this has been going on for a great deal of time. I mean, he was really first, his rehabilitation really gathered speed first in the 1980s and then into the 1990s, when under Özal, they began to name roads and buildings and stadia and dams after Menderes. So his name began to appear as an honorific. Then, late 1980s, Izmir Airport was actually named after Adnan Menderes. And so that process has been going on for a long time. And with each of those namings, there's been a kind of frisson of anger, if not disgust, from the secularists. And I think this just kind of reached a point of absolute anger and disgust in terms of what happened last year. But I don't think it was I don't think that was the trigger, if you like, for the coup of 2016. I think this is a process that has been going on, and while it has caused a certain amount of distaste among secularists, I'd be surprised if that was actually the trigger.
You know, there's a couple of very interesting threads here. You have the 2016 coup, which of course is in the tradition of coups, but within that tradition, quite frankly, is a very debatable argument about whether Ataturk, who is the hero to all the military, ever wanted the military interfering in politics. So in a sense, one could say that the coup makers, or at least the military coup makers in 2016, were following in the footsteps of the 1960 coup makers in rejecting the legacy of Ataturk against military intervention. At the same time, one could look at the Gulenists, who clearly, regardless of how high it reached in the Gulen organization, who knows? That's another day. But clearly there were many Gulenists who were involved in the coup attempt in 2016. And yet, people who are supporters of Erdogan are in many ways drawn from the same socioeconomic and religious practice pool or reservoir as the Gulenists. I mean, there was a time when Erdogan and Gulen were working hand in glove with each other.
Yeah.
And so the Gulenists, as much as the military, were in fact participating in a coup that was against their own legacy, or rather the legacy of Turkey.
I think the problem with that argument, and while I accept it, is that the putschists, the juntas, the coup officers can always make that argument that I made at the beginning, that whatever Ataturk said, he also wanted whoever was in a position to do so to protect and maintain his secular legacy. And there is that point that you go back to, that by a different definition, you could describe Ataturk's assumption of power in 1919, finally culminating in the victory of the War of Independence in 1922, as nothing less than a protracted coup by Ataturk. So you can argue this both ways. What I think is really interesting is how the people view the role of the coup in Turkish life, because the coup in 1960 drew quite broad support from a lot of people, whereas the coup in 2016, it seems to me, did not. Even people who did not consider themselves as supporters of Erdogan tended to take the position that the army had no place on the streets that night, and were very, very clear in standing up against the army and trying to encourage them to leave. Many of them wanted Erdogan to be removed, but this is the important thing, at the ballot box, not at the not by the barrel of a gun. And that seems to me, that's where I draw such hope. It seems to me that even if the Turkish army hasn't understood fully its responsibilities yet. The Turkish people have begun to understand what democracy really means, and they're prepared to fight for it.
Yeah, I mean, so we're going to have to wrap up in a minute, but could you comment on how these different threads that have existed since 1960 to the present, what was going on when Erdogan tried to force the rerunning of elections, municipal elections that didn't quite go the way he wanted, and how the Turkish people responded? And I think that's another sign of hope, but could you also talk about how that reflects maybe there's been some changes, even though there's been a great deal of polarization? So, just kind of respond to that.
Politics and sort of political motivation is always very, very complicated, isn't it? And of course, what we haven't talked about is, that for a lot of people vote depending on the condition of their pocket and what they think that the vote will do in terms of ameliorating the problems of it. And I think that, that vote, the Istanbul mayoral vote, which you're referring to in 2019, was a very good case of Erdogan believing, when it went against his party, that he actually had the power to twist the result to his advantage, only to discover when he presented that reality to the electorate that they were having none of it. And that, as you say, that seems to me to be a very good demonstration of the fact that there are a lot of people in Turkey who absolutely believe in democracy and will fight for the ballot, whatever it takes. And in that case, it was a case of organizing, marshalling resources so as to get every single potential voter back to Istanbul for the rerun, which happened in the summer of 2019. Right. So it seems to me that, that sort of plays into the same notion that the Turkish electorate has grown up, and some 70 years after the first elections, the ones which brought Menderes to power in 1950, they are not going to stand for coups, even if some people in the army still think it's the way to actually run affairs in the country.
Yeah, I think there's so many lessons to be drawn, but I think it's a great parallel that, you mentioned that people wanted Erdogan removed, but by the ballot, not by the bullet.
Exactly.
And what we saw in 2016 was the vast majority of the Turkish people said, no more coups. That's not what we do, and we won't accept it.
Yeah.
And then we saw the same thing in 2019 in the Istanbul election. The vast majority of voters in Istanbul said, no, that's not how you do democracy, Mr. President. What you do is you hold free and fair elections and you accept the will of the people.
Exactly, except that I would slightly qualify that by saying that it's also accepted that the elections are not entirely free and fair. The ballot box is free, but we all know that the AKP party controls the media to a great degree. So the opposition needs to do a great deal to overturn the inbuilt advantage that the governing party has built for itself. But they proved in 2019, I think, that it can be done. And right. Especially if there is the provocation of the governing party saying, we don't like that result, we won't have it, we'll rerun it, then it seems to me that it's more likely in those situations that it won't be overturned, but that in fact the majority will be increased to the advantage of in this case, the opposition party.
Okay, we're going to have to wrap up. I have to tell you that this is fascinating. My background is as a historian and an analyst of politics. But I don't think you can understand a country's present and where it might go in the future unless you really understand its past. And I think you're absolutely right that the story of Menderes has been overlooked. And, I would, again, encourage everybody who has the opportunity to go to your website, somewherewonderful.com, and read all the things that you're writing, not only about the coup, but all this wonderful travel stuff. It's really quite fascinating. And also to remind people that to get the book at this present stage, because people in America haven't gotten on it, Go to Amazon.com, just put in the search for Jeremy Seal, A Coup in Turkey, or go to Book Depository US. And that's the way to get your hands on a copy of the book. And I would strongly encourage you to do that. Again, Jeremy, thank you so much for your time today. I understand you'll be doing something soon with my good friend Chris Kilford. Could you just...
Yeah, the Canadian International Council. That's next week, the 12th of May. Yeah, I don't know if I can get you a link to that. There is a link, but it's the 12th of May, and it's I think it's 10 a.m. Pacific time on the 12th.
Okay, so for those of you who would be interested in following up, that's the Canadian International Council. And I think I'm pretty sure that that's an open session. So
it is an open session.
Okay, so if you are interested, go to Canadian International Council. It's the Victoria branch, but I think if you just do Googling on Canadian International Council,
you should be able to register.
You should be able to get it, and I would recommend that if you want to follow up. Okay, for Anatolian Dispatch and Aval News, that's all we have today. Thank you all very much. Take care. Bye-bye.
Take care.